Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. It happened again. I ran into someone who asked if I am really so conservative that I have trouble turning left even when I'm driving, and I had to affirm that, yep, that is true. I really am, and it also means, wow.
What happened, Don?
I got lost there. I have it playing in the background. I answered I am, and that reminds me, this is not a safe space for those who may be easily offended by having their ideas challenged. This is broadcast number 68, and our friend Dr. James Hoffmeier, professor of Old Testament and Near Eastern history and archaeology at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, is joining us to respond to the question, does archaeology support or contradict the Bible? My name is Don Vino, and I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast, and our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of tonight's webcast. And here is Ron with his life jacket on.
Yes, almost. Greetings from sunny, humid Florida, where, I moved from the Windy City down here to Windy, Florida. We had a visitor, a house guest or a state guest, Irma. She was not a very polite one, but fortunately, I'm still here to talk about it. Our sponsors tonight include World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for dubious doctrines, half-baked heresies, and other ideas whose time has gone. World's End Theology Outlet and the Bible Buffet. It's not your father's worship experience, the Bible Buffet. And to ensure your continued access to this program, please go to midwestoutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And back to our guests here, and I have to figure out how to stop. There we go.
I know. We're having kind of technical issues going on here tonight.
I came in on the wrong login. That was my problem. Everything looks different when you do that, so I'm going to have to...
Oh, I got you. Okay. Dr. Hoffmeier, actually, Dr. Hoffmeier and I used to go to church together. It seems like a lifetime or two ago. And I am really glad to have you on tonight. Why don't you give us a little bit of your background? You, if I recall, you were born in Egypt, right?
That's right. Yes, I grew up in Egypt, born there, and traveled a lot in Egypt. My father was, although a missionary, is very interested in ancient history and archaeology, and so we traveled all over, visited the sites of Egypt. I climbed the Great Pyramid when I was 14. I visited Jericho and Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, when I was 10. And so I had an early, if you will, introduction to the world of archaeology, and it seemed like so much fun that I might as well make a career of it.
So is your career on the rocks, as it were? Is that one of those?
Yes, it lies in ruins.
Now, when you and I met, actually, I think the first time you and I met, Dr. Hoffmeier, was at that church. It was Oakdale Community Church. Is that what it was called?
It was
Oakdale, then there was Bridgeway Community Church.
Yeah, I visited there briefly with my one Sunday with my wife, and then after that, I had you as a professor of Old Testament theology at Wheaton. So our guests should know that you are a professor. Are you still? Have you retired yet?
This will be my last year of full-time teaching
at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School.
Yes, as my shirt says.
It's right there, not the university, but the seminary. And you are the author of several books: Israel in Egypt, Ancient Israel in Sinai. And I mean, I'm looking at the list on Amazon. I recommend anybody go there, and Archaeology in the Bible would probably be an excellent place to start. So we are dealing with a bona fide biblical archaeologist, and for a very good reason, because this has something to do with apologetics.
It has a lot to do with apologetics, and before we get too far into that, we should get something out of the way and off your chest before you lose all of your hair.
Oh, well, hey, okay, I don't know where to go with that. So, yes, we will talk about, since nobody else is talking about it, we might as well. We, of course, as you know, every week we try, if something is worthy enough, you have to be worthy enough for this. It is the coveted Golden Face Palm, or the Face Palme d'Or Award from the Canned Laughter Festival, the Festival de Canned Laughter. And we really had to look hard for a good, worthy candidate for this award this week. And we came up, this is, I should say, the prestigious weekly award recognizing accomplishments of distinction in the fine arts of slanting the facts, spinning the story, and other assorted tomfoolery in connection with Christianity or religion in general. Now, this week, our award goes to some other assorted tomfoolery. Much of the time, it's spent awarding, shall we say, the shenanigans of the media. In this case, it's something that the media has reported. This is a picture of a 19th century gentleman named Oscar Wilde, who was an Irish writer. He wrote plays, fiction, essays, poetry. But, the thing he's noted for most was for having gone on trial for gross indecency in the 19th century. Oscar Wilde was a homosexual. And in honor of that fact, a church in New York, a United Methodist church in New York City in the Greenwich Village neighborhood, well, according to the story that was carried on getreligion.org, they put up a series of paintings modeled after the traditional Christian Stations of the Cross, representing different moments in Jesus' trial and crucifixion. So this is modeled after that, to tell the story of Oscar Wilde's 1895 trial for gross indecency, that is, homosexuality, and subsequent 2-year imprisonment. In each panel, all of which are modeled after then contemporary newspaper engravings of the trial, Wilde sports the gilded halo of Christian iconography. So, this week's coveted Golden Face Palm Award goes to the Church of the Village in Greenwich Village for setting up a religious shrine in its basement to 19th century LGBTQ icon, Oscar Wilde, because that's what he's become, in spite of the fact that official Methodist doctrine still holds that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. This week's coveted Golden Face Palm Award. I thought you'd all be very interested in that.
I am for another reason as well, because I want to again note they likely would not do that with any stories about Muhammad, because the consequences would be fairly grave, I am thinking.
Well, yeah, you don't, if you did some kind of series of paintings about him, they'd be mostly about his conquests and taking multiple wives and getting the recitations of the Quran and so on. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, that would be interesting.
Yeah, probably not. It would be bad. As we kind of move into this topic of history, archaeology, and the Bible, one of the things I've noticed over the years in Israel, particularly, is like on the Temple Mount, for example, the Muslims seem to like to do a lot of digging around in the dark under the Dome of the Rock there, and many are surmising because it is easier to try to get rid of archaeological discoveries that they might come across in the process of digging. Because, of course, they do want to claim that Israel actually never existed prior to being made a state in 1948, and it's always been an Islamic area. It seems to me that the archaeology so far discovered would refute that claim. Now, before we started, you two were kind of talking about archaeological minimalism, I think it was.
Well, that's the topic that I really wanted to address with Dr. Hoffmeier. When I was telling the story, I worked at Wheaton College when he was a professor there. I worked in the advancement division, and we had a rack of periodicals that we typically tried to keep up with. One of them was the Chronicle of Higher Education. And in it one day, I read a story about this thing called biblical minimalism, and it's focused on two scholars at that time. So this is the mid to late 90s, probably toward the late 90s. And one of them was a scholar in Sheffield, at Sheffield University in England. I don't remember his name, but he was contending that the biblical character of King David never existed. If I recall, his argument was we have no more factual evidence for the existence of King David as we do for King Arthur. And I assume he doesn't believe King Arthur was historical either. And this other scholar was an archaeologist named, I think, William Deaver in Arizona, at the University of Arizona. I think it's
yes. Deaver was in Arizona, and the one you're referring to in Sheffield would have been Philip Davies.
That sounds familiar. Yes. So William Deaver was saying, he was arguing, no, there is a lot of evidence for David, or at least there's not enough, or there's enough to assume that he existed. And this was presented in the Chronicle of Higher Ed as an ongoing debate. What surprised me at the time was that it was even happening, because I, having been schooled a bit in the writings of Josh McDowell, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, a popular apologetics text, had appealed to archaeologists, especially a fellow named William Albright, as saying that archaeology was supporting the historicity of the Bible, that did not in any way contradict it. So this was a big surprise to me. And lately it's come up again in the news. I don't have the name of the popular person that I'm thinking of at my fingertips, but I do have it in an open file here somewhere. I passed on her name to you. She's extremely popular in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, the very long Greek name woman from Britain.
Stavrokopoulou, Francesca Stavrokopoulou, professor at the University of Exeter, has become a public figure through British and Australian TV programs. And there are several YouTube videos you can watch where she just frankly says, Moses, I mean, not just David, but Moses and practically every other ancient character from the beginning, especially, book of Genesis, Exodus, and those early books, they just flat out didn't exist. They were just made up. They're just myths. So she's taken this idea of its maximum, it seems to me. So when we contacted you, Dr. Hoffmeier, you said this has been your life for the past, 40 years dealing with this?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, it's not a new problem. It's been with us really probably since the 2nd century AD, when some Gnostic, I don't want to call them scholars, thinkers, philosophers, questioned the authorship of the Pentateuch by Moses, and in other words, questioning traditional understanding. So this has been with us. It's just that there's just a new iteration of it that has started in the 1970s and remains with us. So in up until the 1970s, it was largely a how should we say it, a modern worldview interpretation of Scripture, and then probably starting in the late 70s, going into the 80s and beyond, it's been a postmodern reading of these things. So the end result is the same, whichever school of thought you come from. But I think it's important to say, number one, is that archaeological data, and that's what archaeological finds are, they are data. Data needs to be interpreted. And just like any text, why do two Christians look at the same text and come up with completely opposite interpretations? So archaeological data needs to be interpreted. So if you start with certain assumptions, then that will affect how you this find or that find. So for instance, the whole, when you picked up the debate in the late 90s, it actually went back to the early 90s when people were beginning to question the historicity of David. But back in the 1970s, when I was starting out graduate school, it was Abraham who was on his way out. And so it was the 70s, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the 80s, Moses and the conquest, and basically the slippery slope of minimalism had gone down to David and Solomon in the 90s. So in 1993, actually about 3 weeks before a very important discovery was made at Tel Dan, an archaeological site in northern Israel. I happened to be there with a group of Wheaton College students and walked over this area, which 3 weeks later, an inscription was discovered that dated to the 9th century BC, right to about the time of King Jehu of the Bible, so about 841, 842 BC. And this inscription was made by not an Israelite, but by the king of Damascus. And the king of Damascus talks about how he fought and defeated the king of Israel and the king of the house of David. And so 1994, a second fragment of this inscription was found. And so that's why when you picked it up in the 1990s, there were still people trying to say, well, that doesn't mean there was a David. Most, Professor Deaver being one, said, look, if there's a house of David, there's a dynasty of David, there had to have been a David, which of course is absolutely logical. But Philip Davis was still fighting it, and some of his colleagues, because they were so determined a priori that David didn't exist. So finding this inscription with his name on, well, that can't be him because we know he doesn't exist. So you see the way they reason, and a junior high student couldn't get away with that thinking, but some professors in certain universities can get away with that kind of thinking. But important thing then is to realize that there you have something that would appear to be a firm datum indicating there was a historical David, and yet you'll have some who will question it. One scholar even suggested it was a forgery because it didn't fit the theory he had developed over the past couple of years.
I remember the Tel Dan discovery. That was big news at the time. Even mainstream media outlets were covering it, if I recall.
Yes, it got wide coverage. And it didn't take long before it was on display in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. So it's there for everybody to see.
So has a scholarly consensus emerged that the minimalists were wrong about this one? That David really did exist?
Well, what they would say, or some of them would say now, is, well, the Bible presents David as a bigger-than-life character who was this great conqueror, and maybe he had a little kingdom and a few sheep up in the hills, but he was no big conquering king. So they'll accept him as maybe being the ancestor of the dynasty that later comes along, but he's not the man presented to us in 1st and 2nd Samuel.
One of the things that fascinated me as I studied Old Testament theology under you and have read, kept up on it since then, is that evolutionary presuppositions seem to be creeping into the whole field of biblical criticism before Darwin came on the scene. In other words, the assumption that religion evolves from a primitive state to a complex state, and therefore what we find in the Bible cannot possibly have reflected the times they claim to portray, because these documents, they just couldn't have. I mean, it had to be a primitive type of thing. And so this kind of fits in with David being this tribal chieftain instead of this great king, because the earlier you go, according to them, it seems the more likely you're going to encounter myth rather than history. And the earlier you go, it's got to be more primitive and simple, and it had to develop into something complex later. Is that a adequate perception of how academia has been operating since the early 19th century?
Yeah, although the evolutionary approach to the study of religion kind of goes hand in hand with Darwinism. I don't think that's pre-Darwinian. Yeah, that
I don't
pretty much.
They wouldn't have called it evolutionary, but they talk about the way they talked about it, the way they spoke. It sometimes you might think about some of their New Testament criticism, which was going on before Darwin, where if you encounter a highly developed church with church offices in the pastoral epistles, well, they couldn't have been written by Paul, because there's no way they could have had
that kind of structure.
That kind of structure so early in the church, because things have to develop gradually. and that's just too much complexity for the first century.
Well, the whole evolutionary approach to religion. One of the books I've written that's on Amazon is called Akhenaten and the Origins of Monotheism, and that book, which just came out a couple years ago with Oxford University Press, really tries to deal with the view that Israelite religion developed or evolved, and that monotheism is the final phase of that development, and it doesn't really come into play until the period of the Babylonian exile and beyond, that is in the 6th and 5th century. And before that, Israel wasn't really a monotheistic nation, simply because that was way too sophisticated for people 1000 BC, or
Right.
in the Moses era, if there was a Moses. So yes, so they tend to see this evolution in religion going from animism to polytheism to ultimately ending up with monotheism. So I wrote about the pharaoh Akhenaten, who reigned in the 14th century BC, and it's very clear that he was a monotheist. You might want to debate, as some have, was there any relationship between him and Moses? I don't think so. In any event, the very fact that in the 14th century BC you have a monotheistic king means that you could very well have Moses starting a monotheistic faith around the same time, plus or minus a century. So it didn't have to evolve. I think Akhenaten's religion was a response to a particular experience that he had, that he related to, thought was a revelation of this particular deity. And so he really starts out very early in his career. He's clearly a standard polytheist, but within a couple years, he's hardcore monotheist, wiping out inscriptions and statues of other gods, closing their temples, etc. So he goes from polytheist to hardcore monotheist in about 6 years.
Wow. I remember coming across. Oh, I'm getting some echo. Are you guys getting that?
Yeah, we were hearing it.
I didn't.
Oh, good. I remember coming across that name and reading about it, and it seemed like it was very controversial, that there were a lot of people who question Akhenaten's existence or whatever, or I don't know, or whether this was really a true story. Is that also?
No, what they question there is whether he was truly a monotheist, and some would say he was a monotheist of sorts, but there is a category that people use now called an exclusive. As in Islam, the creed is there is no God but God, right?
Right.
In other words, there's no others that exist. There's only one. It's not that I worship one and Charlie down the road worships another one who's different. That's not monotheism. Exclusive monotheism means not only do you worship one, but you're intolerant towards anyone else who has other gods. And that certainly was what Akhenaten was. Others debate that, and I've tried to show that they're simply wrong about that. But that again illustrates how archaeological data, ancient texts, can be read and interpreted in opposite ways by two very competent scholars.
When I was in your class, I remember another student came up to you and asked if he could write a paper on henotheism in Israel. And the reason that sticks in my memory is because I'd never heard the word henotheism before. I had to run and look it up. And it sounds like what you're describing, as opposed to exclusive monotheism, henotheism would teach that there's one God for us, but there might be other gods for other people.
Right.
Yeah. So, and so some people would say that...
In other words, you're not denying the existence of the other ones.
Right. I think Don, Jehovah's Witnesses would qualify as henotheists.
Well, Mormons definitely would. Jehovah's Witnesses, they waffle because they would say that only Yahweh, the Father, is God. Others may be sort of God-like. The Son may be God-like. He's created with God-like characteristics, but he is not the God. He's a small God-like creature. but that's a whole different discussion for another day. So that they really wouldn't be henotheists. Mormons would be henotheists.
Okay. Now, when you, did you get a chance to watch Francesca Stavrakopoulos' videos, Dr. Hoffmeier? I know there were quite a few of them.
I saw a couple of her YouTube pronouncements, yes.
What did you think? What was your reaction?
Well, I think she's clearly drunk deeply from the waters of minimalism, and it's interesting.
That's gracious. That's very gracious.
Yeah, but she's extremely. How should I say it? Most good scholars never make categorical statements about something never or impossible. So I think she's such a popularizer, such a celebrity, and I wouldn't take her that seriously. She has written a couple serious books, but I think she enjoys the limelight and tries to be provocative. But again, you'll notice that her statements are always or typically just categorical denials that something happened or existed without any argument as for why or what evidence there may be to suggest otherwise. So she's clearly an ideologue.
Yeah, I think also it benefits her that she's young, she's attractive, and she can be funny. She goes to the programs I've seen her on are like the Australian or British equivalents of the Daily Show. They're not what you call highbrow, programs, and she makes these sweeping statements. Nope, didn't exist. No, it didn't happen. And at the same time, though, she says, "But I love the Bible."
Yeah,
I think this is what keeps her popular. Oh, the Bible is just this wonderful book, and so she can't be accused of.
As long as she can change it into what she wants it to be. So yeah, I mean, it's a little disingenuous.
I love the Bible the way I love Grimm's fairy tales, kind of thing. I mean, it's got such interesting stories in it.
Yeah.
But the sweeping statements that you mentioned, Moses never existed, blah blah. They remind me so much of a PBS documentary I watched on the making of the Old Testament years ago, in which this I assume he's a scholar, but he would get out the way it was presented is that hardly any of the Old Testament was really written, at least not in its final form, until the exile in Babylon. And they would have these dramatized representations of how this happened with actors, and then the narrator, who I believe was a professor somewhere, would come on the program and say, well, now we know how the Old Testament was written. In other words, now it's settled. We know that none of this stuff was written down until the exile. He presented it as scientific fact. You have, I take it, a somewhat different perspective on that.
Well, you were breaking up quite a bit there, but I think I got the gist of what you were saying. Yeah, I think, first of all, I think it's they buy into a fallacy. That let's just say that their assumption is correct, that the stories or the narratives about David or Moses were written 500 or 1,000 years after the events they claim that the Bible claims happened. So they say because there's so much time in between, there's no way this could be an accurate memory. These stories were handed down orally, and therefore they were twisted and turned, and when they were finally written, they're so removed from reality you can't take them. Well, if that's true, then how can anybody today, 2,000 years after Julius Caesar, write a book about Julius Caesar? It really renders futile the whole exercise of writing history. The question really is, are the sources you use reliable? Now, we know, for instance, when the chronicler, whoever, that's what we call the writer of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, because no name is identified for him, but so he's called the chronicler. The chronicler gives us footnotes. When he talks about a king of Israel or a king of Judah, he will say at the end of the reporting on a particular king, is this not written in the records of Samuel the prophet, the vision of Gad the prophet, the book of Nathan the prophet? So apparently when the chronicler is writing around 500, let's say, it appears that he actually had much earlier records going back to contemporaries of the kings that are being described. So the question really is, does the historian, whether it's a present-day historian or an ancient historian, have reliable sources? Now, I'm setting aside the question of the divine involvement with the human writer and inspiration. I'm just looking at it as a historian might. And I would say you can't reject a piece of writing hundreds of years after the events. They can be just as accurate as something that's contemporaneous.
Boy, that's good. I had not really considered that about Chronicles. That's great information, though. So
Yeah.
he's giving you footnotes as he's going along, telling you, look, I have information that was written down that I'm working from to put this compilation together for you. I like that. Ron,
Right,
by the way, it is about time to take a quick break here.
Please hold that thought, Dr. Hoffmeier. We'll be right back. Listen, we have our friends at World's End Theology Outlet, and they have some questions. Are you still trying to figure out how to clean up in the ministry business? Do you want to finally learn how to get to the bottom of growing a successful church? Would you like to flush away your failures and start having your best church now? Well, then you need Charlatan Ultra Soft, because nothing says theologically soft like Joel Osteen's Charlatan Ultra Soft. Personally tested by the man himself, it provides comfort where it counts, it wipes away even the most stubborn orthodoxy, and it comes with a money-back guarantee. Charlatan Ultra Soft, keep those butts in the pews with it. Available at World's End Theology Outlet. Okay.
So you too can clean up on the ministry business.
Yes. Hope you kept that thought going, Dr. Hoffmeier. Where were we?
Oh.
Okay. You turned off his mic. Okay.
Are we back on?
Now we're back on. Yeah.
No, we're not.
No, we're not. You got to turn him back on.
I'm trying to. I'm not getting him for some reason.
Oh, boy.
Dr. Hoffmeier, hold on a second. We're having a glitch, and I don't know why. How's that?
I still see it turned off.
Why is that?
I don't know. He's trying.
I wonder. He may not even know how to turn it on.
If you hover your mouse near the top of your image, there's a bar that comes up, and one of them says mute microphone or unmuted. It should be colored red right now. Okay, he's coming.
Oh, he left.
I think he left. Well, I hope he comes back.
He'll be back.
He'll be back.
So, in the meantime, let me go over here. Oh, here he is.
Here I am.
Oh, thank you.
There you are. Okay, now we got you. That was kind of a weird thing. Now, do you remember your thought that you had before you so?
Yes.
Okay.
I just wanted to get the reference because it's the first one I have in mind is 1 Chronicles 29. At the end of the report on King David, it says, and this is in verse 29, 29, now the acts of King David from first to last are written in the Chronicles of Samuel the seer. Now that may be what we call 1st and 2nd Samuel. But then he says, and the Chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and the Chronicles of Gad the seer. And then when you go to the end of Solomon's reign, which is 2 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 29, now the rest of the acts of Solomon from first to last, are they not written in the history of Nathan the prophet, and the prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite, and the visions of Edu the seer? So he gives you a little bibliography of 3 sources he uses. Now the point is, none of those sources have survived. We don't have the book of Nathan, the book of Ahijah, the book of Gad. So what's amazing was that they survived David all the way through the exile and must have accompanied some Judean person into the exile, and then after the exile, they're still available. So there you have sources that go right back to the day of David and Solomon, which the chronicler is able to use.
Wow, that is amazing.
And it seems unlikely that an exilic writer would have fabricated those references, because people would have been able to say, well, wait a minute, where are those things? It's just a very odd thing to put in there if you are making it up.
Yeah, well, especially because I've pointed out David is not presented as a morally pure man. And if this was somebody who was trying to, and you think about it, this is the man who's the model for the Messianic king, and yet we see, obviously, he can't be the ideal because of his, sinfulness, his sin with Bathsheba, his murder of Uriah. So if you were trying to hide the truth stuff, you wouldn't just talk about his conquest and how great he was, but you would ignore the things that made him look bad. And the scripture writers don't ignore that.
I've been reading lately about these, I don't know if this is a recent name that they've come up for it with, but it's called the criterion of embarrassment. It's used in judging the historicity of a text. If it's something that would be embarrassing, then it's more likely to be true. People would tend to, if they're going to make something up, they would tend to make up something that would glorify, something that would paper over embarrassing details. But if they're going to report them in a forthright fashion, then that adds credibility to the account.
Well, I absolutely, and that's one thing we could say also about the origins of Israel as a people in Egypt. The fact that they were slaves is not exactly a boastful thing. You'd want to make up, as you'd want to offer a much more glorious picture. If you could make up a story about your origins, it wouldn't be that you were slaves.
Yeah.
And so that too gives credibility. And yet, one of the things that came out of the 1980s, 90s, and ever since is the Israelites never were in Egypt. They never were a people who originated in Egypt, led by Moses, etc. But that's one thing that's very hard for them to get around. It's not a very glorious origin.
So when we are confronted by somebody who comes to us and says, Moses could not have existed because, and they usually go, many of them, from what I've heard, have gone into the Exodus and said, if that thing had actually happened, you'd expect to find some evidence of it, that somewhere upwards of 2 million people crossed over the Red Sea and came down to Sinai. Wouldn't they have left some trace of themselves? Wouldn't they have, if they stayed there for 40 years, wouldn't we expect to find something? How do we answer that?
I would tell them to go read my book, Ancient Israel in Sinai.
Aha. I take it the answer's too long for this program.
Well, it is complex, but it starts with, I think, a faulty assumption that we're dealing with millions of Israelites leaving at the Exodus. And that requires an explanation in and of itself. If there were, as the Bible suggests, 600,000 men, then they outnumbered the Egyptian army about 15 to 1. Because we know the Egyptian army was about 25,000. So if the Israelites had that many armed men, and that's they could have walked away from Egypt anytime they wanted. And they wouldn't have needed intervention to conquer a little town like Jericho. So the issue really has to do not so much with what the Hebrew text says, but how it's been translated down through the centuries for us. And I'd be happy to talk about that if you'd like.
Yes, I would. You've piqued my curiosity. Were there 600,000 men or not?
Well, what the text reads, and what we're talking about here is Exodus chapter 12. Exodus chapter 12, let's get the exact reference. and that's verse 37. It says the Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot besides women and children. That's why people, if you have 600,000 men and women and children, you're probably dealing with 3 million or more people. So the Hebrew text actually reads 600, and the Hebrew word is Eleph. And the word Eleph in the Bible is translated 3 different ways. It can be translated 1,000. It can be translated clan. You remember Gideon, when he says, my clan is the weakest in Israel. This is an excuse for not following God. My clan is the weakest in Israel. And that word is Eleph. I think the KJV may translate it my 1,000, which doesn't make any sense. But so the word can also mean clan. And then thirdly, it's a word for a military unit. And you can see that in 1 Samuel 17, when Jesse sends David to the battlefront to visit his brothers who are fighting the Philistines. And he gives Jesse gives David some cheese and says, take this to the commander of their Eleph. And it's translated unit. So the question is, how do we translate 600 Eleph in Exodus 12? 600 clans of an undisclosed number, 600 military units, or 600,000? Well, the translation in our English translations have always been 600,000. So anyway, that's a translation issue as far as I'm concerned. And I mean, the present day population of Israel is slightly more than double what it was coming out of Egypt. So that's pretty hard to believe, because Tel Aviv is a city with 30-floor high-rise apartments, and the archaeological record shows small villages with little houses where the Israelites lived. So I think the problem is not the accuracy of the Bible. It's simply that it's been mistranslated and therefore misunderstood.
What do you think the most likely rendering would be of that phrase?
Well, I think in that particular context, and because a little bit later on in the book of Numbers, we actually have it's sometimes said to be a census, but it says they did how shall we say it, a draft of those eligible to be in Israel's army from age 20 and up, able to go, and it comes out 600 Eleph and something. So the 600 Eleph seems to be fighting-aged men. So I think it's 600 units of men, military men, plus their families. How much is in an Eleph? That's another debate that we just have to shrug our shoulders and say, we really don't know.
Okay, so a fighting unit could be 10, or it could be 50, or it could be 100. We just don't really know what that number
right.
would be.
I mean, think about in the battle after Jericho, the Israelites want to take on this relatively insignificant place called Ai. And the response is, it's such a little insignificant place. We only need to take, 3 Elephs, 3,000.
Mm-hmm.
And they encounter a force that set them back, and 37 men were killed. Well, if you have 3,000, you lose 37. That's about a 1% loss.
Not a big deal in war.
Not a big deal militarily, but that was seen as a major humiliating defeat for them. So I think they probably sent 150 or something like that, but that's just a guess on my part.
Okay.
Well,
So
now that really helps explain those kind of passages of scripture in a new way for me. So, what was the name of that book?
Ancient Israel in Sinai.
So you begin with the assumption that there were were not 2 to 3 million people, but even let's say, would you say there were 250,000 people?
No.
No. How many do you think?
No. I would think a few tens of thousands at best.
And it's much easier to explain the lack of physical evidence even if they were there for like 40 years.
Well, they weren't in one spot for 40 years.
That's true. Okay.
And they lived in tents.
And they lived in tents.
And typically, people traveling in the desert, even until modern times, would carry water when they traveled in animal skins, which, by the way, that in the Bible, a number of places, when Abraham sends off Hagar into the desert, he sends her with a skin of water. When the Gibeonites come and pretend that they've been traveling from this distant land and their leather skins are all dried out. So, in other words, the kind of things, you're not going to take big, heavy pottery with desert. So the reality is I wouldn't expect to find lots and lots of artifacts. So that's, to me, that's not surprising.
And these bags would be biodegradable. They would have decomposed a long time ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, animal skins. They might have used baskets, basketry, because you can haul bread and grain and stuff. And you want stuff to be as light as possible, simply because you're either carrying it or putting it on the back of a donkey. You're not dealing with pickup trucks you're throwing stuff in the back of. So I think so. Part of the problem is that very often the Bible have a very unrealistic expectation.
We almost end up reading 20th and 21st century transportation modes, for example, back into the text when it just really isn't that way. You've got long, even wagon trains,
Right. Well, I was going to give an illustration. One individual was suggesting that the Israelites could in one day have traveled in Sinai from one point to another point, and it was a good distance. And a friend of mine critiqued it by saying, well, why don't you demonstrate how that's done, not wearing modern hiking boots, but wearing sandals or going barefoot, see how you could do it. But again, this is an illustration of what you're saying. Often we think of all our modern conveniences as somehow they existed long ago. Yeah.
All right, we're going to try to do another quick commercial here, and I want to ask you about somebody. I will refer to him as the Geraldo Rivera of archaeology, let's say.
Oh.
But Ron, why don't you do a quick?
Did he uncover vaults of ancient criminals?
I'll tell you in a minute. Yeah.
Alrighty. Okay, we've got some questions for you. Are you tired of hearing all about the difference between the milk of the word and the meat of the word? Are you wondering when your church is going to get around to serving the ice cream and cheesecake of the word? Does your pastor take this whole Bible thing way too seriously? Well, then you need to check out the Bible Buffet. Everything at the Bible Buffet is arranged around your convenience and your enjoyment. Everything there is gluten-free, trans-fat-free, and truth claim-free. There are some wonderful dishes that you just really need to check out. This week's menu, the regular Sunday specials include Arian appetizers, Sabellian succotash, Galatian goulash, Gnostic nut salad, and Pelagian pie. The Bible Buffet is a fully accredited ministry of the Church of Smorgasbordianism. The Bible Buffet, it's not your father's worship experience. You need to check it out.
Okay. Now, this is a name I am guessing you're familiar with, Simcha Jacobovici.
Yes.
The Naked Archaeologist.
That was easy for you to say.
Yeah, well, I can't say it 3 times. I can't anyway. A couple of years ago, of course, he captured everybody's attention because he had supposedly found the assuary of Jesus, and they were digging around, kind of like Geraldo opening the safe.
Wasn't it James?
That was James, the brother of Jesus.
Oh, it was James, right? James, the brother of Jesus.
Yeah.
So he's kind of the popular. Everyone likes to get the real skinny on archaeology from Simcha. Thoughts?
Yakovovich, yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think of him?
Well, actually, I made the mistake of agreeing to be interviewed for a program he made once.
Oh, okay.
So, but
that tells me
he
something
kept
right
on,
there.
he kept on re-asking the question, trying to make me agree with him. And anyway, so yeah, he is how should I say it? He has his own agenda. He is a very committed Orthodox Jew, and so I think there's a certain anti-Christian polemic in what he does. But in any event, yeah, he makes a living trying to make sensational claims. He's a great movie or TV program maker. I mean, as a
storyteller. He's a good storyteller.
cinematography wise, he does beautiful work. Yeah, I don't think very highly of him.
Okay, well, that's all we need to know. we don't have to go too far with that.
I was going to say, when it comes to things in the Old Testament, he is usually very, very conservative, because he's obviously, his agenda is to demonstrate the authenticity of the Torah and the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. He's a little bit less willing to give the New Testament the same leeway that he gives his scripture.
Okay. And of course, that's connected with establishing the title to the land for him. Is that correct?
I don't know for sure, and the reason I say that is because many Orthodox Jews don't believe in some do and some don't believe in the state of Israel.
Okay.
Because some think that Israel that they want to be a part of is the one the Messiah comes and sets up, and the secular government can't be that. So some are very anti the current government and Israel. Others are saying, well, we'll stay here and we'll wait for the Messiah to come and do that. Okay. But I don't know where he stands in that. With regard to the origins of Israel, the Israelites in the land, I don't know, but that's a big deal right now.
Sure. Well, that's a good question. So I'd like to go back for a second, and Ron, I don't mean to completely take this over, but
no, do please.
I'm just intrigued as you have gone through just a couple of places where you can go to Scripture and go, okay, here's what we see with this, like Chronicles. We have a bibliography within Chronicles that would indicate there was pre-existing documents that he was working from. Well, that's interesting. I had never really heard that before. And the whole question about how many actually left Israel, again, that's kind of a new concept. This word Aleph has a range of meaning, so which way should it have been translated? And we're a little uncertain about that. Now, that doesn't mean, and this is important, that doesn't mean that you are saying the Bible is not inspired, or we aren't saying the Bible is not inspired or isn't God's word. We are saying there's a word that we are uncertain how to translate from God's inspired word.
Yes. And again, bear in mind, when the ancient Hebrews were writing, and every time you encounter a number in the Bible, it's not a numeral. So it's like when you're writing your check and you write SIXHUNDRED 600. So in the case of our passage in Exodus 12:37, it's Sheish Me'ot Elef, 600,000. It's not like somebody just added too many zeros. There are no zeros. So in other words, it can't be just a little scribal, put the comma in the wrong place and too many zeros. So yes, it's an issue of translation. I think Christians, evangelical Christians, conservative Christians, want a huge number just because it makes what happened all the more miraculous, that God brought Israel out of Egypt. And I, if the text was clear that it's 10 million people, I have no trouble believing that. But I don't think that's what the text is saying. In this case, I think another meaning is intended, and as I suggested, based on our knowledge of ancient Egyptian sources, the size of the Egyptian army. I mean, after all, Pharaoh did pursue him with 600 chariots. How many million people can you bring back with 600 chariots?
No, it's true.
Anyway, those are the sort of things one has to look at in the text. When you have, and for those who've traveled in Israel and gone to a place like Jericho, and you see how small the ancient mound is.
Right.
As I say, it's the size of about 6 football fields, two by two end to end, 6 football fields, or 3 end to end, 2 by 2. It's a pretty small place, and yet we read about the Israelites when Moses sends out the spies. They're just scared to death of these huge cities and these big armies. That doesn't seem to make sense if you have a huge army as they did. So that's why you have to look at the whole thing and not just sort of pick on one verse that in this case may be translated wrongly, but most lay people aren't going to be able to sort that out.
Yeah. Well, we have some books to get, don't we, Don?
Well, I definitely want to get this Ancient Israel and Sinai. That will be very helpful to me. I mean, some things like my friend Dr. Norm Geiser, he's done things like when skeptics ask, and one of the questions that often comes up is seeming contradictions revolving around numbers. Solomon's in one place it seems to say that Solomon had 40,000 horse stalls, and another place it says he had 4,000 horses. Is that a contradiction? And he's basically saying the same thing you are, is the way that they write out the numerical equations. It's not quite the same as ours, where you could add additional zeros, but there's other ways to understand the translation. So it isn't, and we really do know the number is probably 4,000, not 40,000.
Yeah, and again, this is where archaeology can be helpful. The city of, what we believe was the ancient city of Ramesses, mentioned in Exodus 1:11, and the city from which the Israelites' exodus began. That site has been excavated for some years. It's in the northeastern delta of Egypt. And one of the discoveries made about 20 years ago was an ancient stable. It's a huge stable, and it was calculated that it could accommodate somewhere around 500 horses. And so you imagine, okay, if this is the size of stables, how many would you need to accommodate 40,000 horses? And that's helpful when you start to see the comparative material. It helps bring the biblical material into perspective.
Right. I like that.
One of my colleagues, Dr. John Munson, who grew up in Israel and lived there until he came to college, and then went back, studied more, and has been going back a lot ever since. He keeps saying, I want to write a book called Bringing the Bible Down to Size.
Oh, I like that.
And that's because we tend to read things with an overly expansive mental picture of what things were like. I mean, just when you read about Solomon's temple, and then when you realize how small the temple itself really was, those are the sort of things that, again, people read, get these mental images that are simply exaggerated, and
and it's kind of as exacerbated in our media age, because you have kind of a Cecil B. DeMille effect on understanding the Bible.
Sure,
everything is grandiose.
It's interesting. For instance, I had a discussion with a man very interested in the Exodus, and he questioned my theory about the location of the crossing of the sea, the body of water, And he says, well, where is the mountain? By the sea. I said, what mountain by the sea? And I said, go back, look at all the descriptions in Exodus chapter 14 and 15. There's no mention of a mountain, but in his mind there was a mountain. I don't know where that came from.
Wow.
And so people get these mental images that aren't even in the biblical text. And one of the dangers, of course, is where people end up not defending the Bible, but their misunderstanding of it. And that's when I think things can become very embarrassing for a person. And unfortunately, the critics of the Bible are often as guilty for naive, simplistic readings of the Bible as many Christians can be, just as easily guilty. Develop a theory, and it's, you know, it's founded on a lack of a proper reading of the text.
Well, you know, we deal a lot with that kind of a question here at Midwest Christian Outreach, because I kind of developed something that I call spiritual AIDS, AIDS, the acquired ignorance of the doctrines of Scripture, because we seem to have a dearth of serious Bible teaching in too many churches, and so a lot of people formulate their ideas based on popular level books or films or documentaries on A&E or something like that. And so we, you know, we are constantly trying to unknot this. You know, the latest one is the world is going to end on September 23rd because there's this alignment of the stars that we haven't had, well, except that we have had 4 times in the last 1,000 years. So this isn't new. But you've got the soothsayers out there that somehow this is the biblical understanding of the book of Revelation. I go, where do you get that from?
Yeah.
So
exactly.
This influences our understanding from an archaeological standpoint as well. So it's not just having archaeology try to help us better understand Scripture. It's sometimes archaeology trying to say, where did you get this additional idea about the Bible, because it's just not in the text.
Yep.
So what we need to, I mean, there are going to be Christian kids going off to not just secular universities, but sadly to say increasingly universities that claim to be Christian, and they're going to be hearing this biblical minimalism, I take it, more and more.
Well, they can see it on TV. They don't have to go to university.
That's true.
Right.
There you go. Well,
I had a student once in my archaeology class who was going to be a pastor, and I had him reading some of this minimalist stuff, and he was really agitated. Read this stuff. And then in the next class, I showed a video in which something was on PBS, and the very ideas I was having him read about, trying to give him an critique of, he suddenly saw, this is what's on TV. People in my church are going to read this. I really do need to understand this.
Right.
It wasn't until he saw that this is the idea. These are the ideas that are out there that are scholars say, and then your parishioner, your people in your church come up to you and say, Pastor, what about this? And as I said, I don't want you to come back to me and say, why didn't you tell me about this stuff? Why didn't you prepare me to deal with this? So yes, you don't have to go to university to get it. As you say, you can watch it on PBS, Arts and Entertainment, you name it. I mean, I'm off, and I've been in about, 8 to 10 different programs with Discovery Channel, National Geographic. I can't remember all the ones. I've been History Channel, Learning Channel, and I'm usually the token conservative. I'm the sort of the one voice that they use, typically against the minimalists and so on.
Just so they can say.
So I know what's out there. But it's very helpful.
Okay.
Well, and sometimes, now that's what's going on out there. Sometimes it is as bad coming from so-called Christian teachers. You have guys out there going, okay, I've been to the site where Noah's Ark is at, and I've got a piece of the boat here, and so why don't you send a lot of money so we can go dig it up, bring the ark down here.
Yeah.
We know the Exodus was true because we've now found steel wheels at the bottom of the Red Sea, and here's photographs of it, right?
Right.
And there's a picture of Pharaoh holding one of them, even.
Yeah.
But then Christians are just gobbling this stuff up because they so desperately think
Right.
they need that to prove
Right.
accuracy of the text.
No, you're right. And unfortunately, I think those dilettantes who do those sort of things in the end up hurting people because they naively think this is true, examined against the reality of things. Then I think they can end up turning their back against the gospel because they think, well, you know, here are Christians, they're supposedly telling me the truth, and it isn't true. In fact, there's no evidence for this. Let me just make a point about archaeology, the nature of evidence. We've talked about this before, but you know, one program I was on, an Egyptologist who I know, you know, very credible scholar, statement about, well, we have, after 200 years of archaeological work in Egypt, we have no evidence for the Exodus, or no evidence that there were Israelites there. And I point out that after 200 years of archaeological work in the area where the Bible claims the Israelites were, which is in the northeastern delta, to this day, not one papyrus document has survived. And papyrus is where they would have kept records. You know, big inscriptions on temple walls are not the sort of place where Pharaoh is going to talk about Israelites leaving Egypt.
Or yeah.
But so my point is that from the Pharaonic period, from the period, let's say, back in the delta of Egypt, and it's because of the moisture in the delta, papyrus documents have not survived. It's the same as in Jerusalem. All the excavations at Jerusalem, not one parchment or papyrus document has been found. But at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, you've got tons of fragments and scrolls because it's dry there. It's super arid environment. So the place where the Israelites lived, the fact that we don't have any evidence is not surprising. That's just the way it is because of the environmental realities of the delta.
Got it. Okay, I like that. All right, it is about time to do our wrap up, James. I really appreciate you being on here tonight. I learned a couple of really cool things that I am going to end up using. Ron, do you want to kind of walk us out of here?
Okay, let's give credit to where credit is due. Oops, I'm sorry. Go back. Okay. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D Opposer. Our Mormons Archives manager is Polygumus. Our Liberal Denominations bureau chief is Lucy Goosey. Transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Our special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pulling. Our technical assistance comes from Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham and Howe. Grievance Resolutions Director, Ivana Pisami. Director of Privacy Assurance, Wiretapping. And original idea sourcing comes from Drew a Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, which are solely responsible for its content, but you'll never be able to prove that in court. So that wraps it up, I think.
That wraps it up for this week, and we will see you all next week. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, James, and be blessed.
Thank you.